our contact details. So I'll hand over to Callie to kick off the discussion. And as per usual, we will have a very casual, relaxed, conversational style approach to this. So over to you, Callie.
Thank you, Janine. So you're probably all sitting back thinking, well, what is the qualities of an effective HR function? And I think to Janine's point about exciting, it's really thinking about, well, what does your HR team actually do for your organisation? And what does it actually need to be successful? And I guess in order to do that, they obviously have their compliance perspective and their administration perspective, but what is that real value add or that strategic aspect that you want to actually provide? So that's where we're going to kind of talk and discuss today. So we're going to have a little bit to understand that. We're going to look at a couple of different areas. We're going to look at the evolution of HR, because I think it's important to know where we've come from to be able to go, well, what is it for the future? We're going to have a little look at the David Urich model. We're going to talk about having a seat at that table and what that actually means. We're looking at key elements of the HR function. And as we said before, what is my value add, which is a really key part of it, as well as, well, how do I measure it? How do I know if I'm actually being successful? Or how do I know if my team is being successful? And what are some of the things we need to think about as part of that? It's all about trying to make that impact and not just do things for the sake of doing it. So let's get started. So to have a look through the history or the evolution of HR, as I've put it here on the slide, sort of HR has been around surprisingly for, 120 or more years. The early 1990s saw the initial introductions of the HR departments, and certainly from the 1920s to the 1950s, HR was sort of more defined as labour managers or labour market, and that was purely around where unions began to form, the industrial relations function, which focused on like the wages and labour disputes. And certainly as I was looking at putting this presentation together, that was initially around created by people sort of saying, hey, we're not going to work 15 hours a day. We're not going to work, 6 days of the week. We really want some kind of guidelines and some sort of structure around that, which is where the unions were created and formed, and of course strikes took place as part of that. So 1960 to around the 1980s, new legislation became passing for those more of those fair employment practices and focus on compliance. So at this point in time, HR, I guess, took on that compliance perspective. They were still doing administration functions, tracking employee records, monitoring the performance, implementing workplace safety, training, that sort of thing. But the personnel management is what it was covered there, sort of covered legal compliance as well. So they sort of started looking at recruiting and hiring and training and assessing their workers and understanding the legislation that was being introduced at that time and making sure that their company was a fair place to work. So 1990s, it started to shift to that more HR management. And became, I guess, as a profession in its own right, and shifted from sort of promoting from within and how that actually impacted. And I guess the HR team was focused on their own business. So they had their own agendas, they were driving their team, they were driving the outcomes. And basically where a lot of that work came from was David Urich's model, who was a business professor back in 1997, to really look at the administration, the compliance, and the strategic aspect. So what does that mean for where we are now in 2019? So as we go through the next slides, we're sort of really just going to keep that open up. I guess it's important to also understand that there's no one answer for this. There's probably lots of different aspects just depending on the size of your team, the size of your organisation, and as per the keyword there, it's the evolution, and I think HR is going to be continuing to evolve over the next few years, and certainly as we move on in this digital world that we live in.
It's really interesting, Kelly, because I remember my first job in HR was in the 1990s, and it was literally when I joined the first organisation in a HR capacity, HR had just been rebranded from personnel to HR, and what we found then was most of the HR managers or personnel managers that I'd been working with had been people who had been administrators, executive assistants, secretaries who'd been asked to start managing contracts and those sorts of things. And when I came in at that time, it was where all of a sudden people were starting to realise that actually people are a critical part of our success as an organisation, and we invest a whole lot into managing other resources in our organisations, and we're not really thinking about how we get the best out of our people. So that was what we started to see in that 1990s and beyond was, well, we actually feel like we need more rigour around this, and it's trying to lift it beyond compliance. So it was definitely interesting. Definitely an interesting evolution. It'll be interesting to talk to many of you around where that evolution has gotten to in your organisations, because I know that for many, HR is still very much a compliance function and an admin function.
Yeah, absolutely, and definitely. And I don't think people in organisations today see that true value, and they don't see the true value in their people, and basically costing the company and organisation hundreds of thousands of dollars, if not millions, because they don't have a strong, sophisticated HR team.
Yeah, and I think that's as we go through today's session, it's really helping HR professionals and leaders in organisations understand what can this value look like. And, you know, again, you and I talk to HR leaders all the time, and we see every differing level from an experience perspective and from the evolutionary perspective. And we can see that when you've got a really strong leader who sees the value in HR, they build HR teams around them, or they bring HR people on who are able to deliver that value. But sometimes you might be in a HR function where you're working with a CEO who hasn't ever experienced that before and doesn't really understand what the value of HR can be, and it can feel really hard to kind of shift that from within the function. So anyway, it'll be interesting as we talk through to get some more insight into that.
Absolutely. So as I sort of mentioned too in our previous slide, debut Uruk model was developed in the late 1990s. So it's been around for 20 plus years or so. And it was originally, I guess, designed to look at those 4 key aspects. So the administrative, the employee champion, the change agent, and the strategic partner. But I guess now with, as I said, the digital work environment introduced, you know, if you think of your Suris, your Googles, the new thinking of designs, the way we work, our desks, our office model, our flexibility, all of this is sort of changing in this new digital world that we live in. So when we look at David Ulrich's model, we still use that as part of our core business in our people advisory team, but it's really looking at those top key. It's really looking at that strategic partner and the change agent, and focusing on with our business leaders that anything you actually do needs to be aligned to not only your HR strategy, but your business strategy as well. And then therefore, if you haven't got those 2 key components actually happening and working and functioning, then everything else can become a part of that. And also change. I think we're constantly evolving. We're constantly changing. As organisations, we're constantly bringing, whether it's new products in, new ways of doing things, and you've got to understand, I guess, the people aspect of that change. So it's really sort of lifting it up to those 4 top 2 squares as such. So just going beyond the administrative duties that I guess previously HR was known for, they still need to be done. I think it's still important to actually mention that while we talk about strategy, you still got to get your HR foundations right. You've still got to have that compliance perspective. You've still got to have key policies in place. Your contracts have got to be right. You know, you've got to have those basic models still continuing and still working within your department. But also too, as we talk about moving to the future, well, what does that strategic partner look like, or what does that change agent actually must be?
Yeah, and what we tend to find is as organisations become bigger, you know, they'll start with no HR function, then they'll get to a point where they realise they need a HR function, but it will be very compliance focused because that's the specific need they might have at that time, and you're not in a point as an organisation where you have specific roles for everything. You know, everybody's kind of all mucking in. The GM or MD does pretty much everything. So, you know, getting those foundations right is really important. And then what I do find for some organisations is they spend so long trying to get those foundations right, or it's clunky and it's difficult and it's time consuming, that means they can never actually quite release themselves or get the recognition that they can add so much more value to the organisation. And, you know, those 2 areas around that strategic partner, as we know, if you don't have the right talent, you know, we've talked about this for the last 20 years, talent is, for most organisations, your key differentiator. Whether it's because they're creating product or selling product, whatever it is, it's the hardest things for your competitors to actually duplicate. So we know that having a really strong strategy around your talent is critical to succeeding in your overall business strategy. But you're right, that change agent element is also massive. And I'm seeing that more and more
Definitely.
in organisations where they're realising that they're doing amazing work in thinking about, we're going to work in different ways, we're going to have, activity-based working, or we're going to implement new systems. And even though, change management has been talked about for a long time, and we see change managers, come on board, we still see a lot of organisations bring change right at the end and go, it's just about communicating and training. And the more we're seeing people bring change in earlier in the process, the more we're seeing the value of what that gives to organisations to really shift and create change for their people.
Definitely.
Not to derail the conversation, but I'm passionate about it.
Absolutely. And I think it's really key to note too is that too, sometimes as a HR professional, you're thinking, right, I've got to be an administrative expert, I've got to be an employee champion, I've got to be a strategic partner, and I've got to be a change agent. It's also really important to note that sometimes it's actually not possible to be all of those 4 things, and you've got to play to your qualities. So if your qualities are, you can see the big picture, you can see that strategic perspective, or you can see the change that needs to happen in your organisation, and you know how to take your employees on that journey with you, then you should play to those strengths and then build your team around. And I think this is certainly very reflective in our own team, is that, people can be sort of really passionate in one quadrant, but you don't need to have all of the quadrants too. I think that's important to state as well. So don't feel like you're thinking then going, oh my goodness, I need to be this, I need to be this, I need to be this, but that's not all of me. I think it's just then making sure that you've got the right people in the right roles.
I think that's a really important point as well, Callie, and you're right, that's how we work on a daily basis. And I know that there is work that you do that you love, that you get right in there and you know all of the detail and that sort of thing. And I know that Marianne breaks out in hives at the thought of doing some of that work. And I know that there are pieces of work that Marianne does around talent where she's amazing at it, and I have to tap into her skill set around that because I know she challenges my thinking.
Yeah.
And I think that's a really important element of HR, actually modelling what leaders should be doing in an organisation. And we talk about that in some of our other webinars around career pathing. We talk about it in terms of learning agility. We talk about it in terms of the 6 Bs of talent management. It's making sure that you're getting the right people in the right jobs to deliver on this.
Yeah. And yeah, complementing your styles and constantly learning from the people that are around you rather than just recreating the same mini-me.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
definitely. So if we move on, we've talked a little bit about having that strategic perspective, and where this sort of comes in is having that actual seat at that table. And what does that actually mean? So you're probably thinking then, well, yeah, I have a seat at the table, but it's about being heard on that table and being an actual key contributor on that table as well. You need to be able to, I guess, comprehend your business. You're not just there to provide yes or no answers. You're actually there to provide good business insight to the whole discussion from those leadership team perspectives. I guess you need to understand the business, you need to know your consumers, you need to also be building your culture that reflects customer expectations. As I said, you need to be that sounding board for those senior leaders, and you need to challenge their thinking, challenge their thoughts, and not just continually just go, oh, okay, we want to do this, sure, let's do it. Really think about, well, is that the right thing for the business? Is that the right thing from a people perspective? And provide that insight that they possibly hadn't considered before. You guys are going to predict the kind of talent that's needed, and hence advice on to mid to long-term talent initiatives. So really thinking, to Janine's point, your talent is your most crucial element. So as the leadership team is discussing new ideas and new initiatives and building their strategy, what are you thinking from a talent perspective and how you can actually manage that?
Yeah, I think we talk about this a lot, and I know on my journey going through senior HR roles and being in different leadership positions, I struggled at different points where I did feel like my role was just to comment on the people side of things. And I think it was really telling at one point in my career, I had a leader who was great at developing me, and his feedback was always, when you've got a leadership team that's functioning really well, every person on that leadership team has a role that is broader than just their technical function. And that's not the only reason that you are there. So you do need to bring to the table more than just how I would apply my technical capability to that problem. You actually need to be able to challenge on, you're saying this is your marketing strategy. However, we've been talking about these different things in the last meetings and I don't understand how this is all coming together. Sometimes you might feel like it's asking the dumb question, but in fact, it's being the critical thought person around that
thinking
table.
outside that square, isn't it? It's really thinking more broadly than that initial, I guess, topic that they're discussing.
Yeah, so for me, it's around at the end of any interaction as part of the leadership team, I want to feel like I was equal in that discussion and I wasn't just taking some information and then going figuring out how to make it happen. I'm actually equal in coming up with the decision. 2, I want to think that I've added value beyond my specific technical capability when I've been sitting at that table. And 3, I want to know that when I'm looking at the other leaders around the table, part of my role is actually as a coach and pushing and challenging their thinking. So if I have a CEO and I'm not adding value to him or her because I'm not challenging them, whether it's at that meeting or whether it's taking them aside afterwards and saying, did you notice this dynamic? Did you see that this was happening? Whatever it is, getting to the end of every one of those interactions and going, what value did I add? And was that really at that strategic level? That's an important part to me about not only having a seat at the table, but maintaining it and delivering value.
Definitely. Because I think too, just to my point in regards to companies, they're just, a lot of companies and what we've seen with the clients that we work, it's all around those quick fixes. So I think our job is to actually look at that broader picture, coach them and develop them and provide, as Janine mentioned, but understanding the business in a bigger detail, but asking those questions as well.
Yeah, it's interesting as well because I often have people say, oh, this is ridiculous. Why are we still in, when I'm in 2019 talking about HR having a seat at the table? Surely HR has a seat at the table.
Yeah.
It's really interesting because what I'm seeing in some industries is some of the operating models are shifting. And in fact, HR is being reduced in the role that they're having in some larger organisations where they outsource a lot. That's great. I get the value of outsourcing to a degree. However, what I'm seeing is more and more those senior HR roles are actually becoming more junior and they're not having that same gravitas at the table. And when I talk to people in those organisations, they will say to me things like, in the past, our HR got our business. They were partnered with us. They were sitting alongside us. They were helping drive decisions. Now, they're being more and more responsive to a problem and helping to solve it, but they're not actually supporting us and partnering us through to achieving our overall strategic goals.
So they've almost taken that step backwards.
That's certainly my view in some cases, and it's not the case all the time, but I think sometimes when we look at how you add value, how you develop a seat at the table, you actually have to have really strong relationships to do a lot of what you do well in HR. And some of these models where they start to pull back from that and go, well, it starts to become more, we drop you in for a particular project, we pull you back out. If you don't have that partnership role, it's actually harder and harder to provide those insights and value.
Definitely. So what are elements of the HR function and what does that actually need to look like? So I guess we sort of talked about this in regards to having that seat at the table, but it's all about, talking about the value add. We talk about it a lot. I know it's going to be something that we constantly repeat, but I think that's the core function in anything that we actually do. It's what's my value add? I can go and deliver a piece of work and it's X, Y, and Z, but I like to give them A, B, and C as well. And I think if we look at that value add in everything that we do, we can be really successful. So the elements of the HR function, so we said, rather than just that administrative and compliance perspective, it's aligning your HR strategy to a business strategy. And we also talk too with our clients that we have is no matter what the size of your organisation is, you can actually have a HR strategy. It could be a small company, but you should still have a HR strategy and it should still be aligned to your business strategy. And we've worked with particular organisations and clients where they want to, again, come in and do the quick fix because it's going to solve all of their problems, but they haven't really thought about what does that mean for their strategy because they haven't actually got a strategy in place. So we've actually worked with them to say, okay, well, what is your overall strategy? What's your people strategy? And how will they therefore fit into your people strategy?
Yeah, so that's an interesting one. I want some really good examples of where we'll get people going, we just want a system. A system's going to solve everything. So, okay, how's that? What's that system need to look like in order to help you achieve your HR strategy. Well, we don't have a HR strategy. Okay, so that means you would make very different decisions around where you would invest from a HR system, how you would implement it, what the impact of it would be. Would you have a whole lot of work that's being driven to the line managers, or in fact, are you central? All of those things that people go, no, I just want a system, just pick something off the shelf and put it in. And when we work with clients to say, let's take that step back of what are you trying to achieve as a business? What's HR doing to support it? All of a sudden, it drives different decisions on that operational level.
Mm-hmm.
And you know, we've been really fortunate to have clients who are very happy to partner really strongly on that. And when you see that shift, it's really powerful.
Definitely.
Yeah.
So the second sort of element that we too would talk about is focus on the right things. And I sort of mentioned this before is don't do things just for the sake of doing things. I think so much we do in society now, and I know whether it's with my children or with my family, it almost becomes just a tick the box exercise. So it's really thinking about, well, what's the basic HR practice that I have to do versus best practice? So really critical to thinking about that strategic aspect of it.
I love this one. And you know what? There's a book that if you're really interested in shifting the way you think about HR and really thinking about how you do, there's that word again, add value in an organisation. There's a book by Patty McCord called Powerful, and she was actually the HR leader in Netflix as they went on their journey to going from a DVD organisation to a digital streaming organisation. I love her. I actually saw her on stage once, and I remember they were talking about performance management. She was talking with a whole lot of other HR directors, and somebody from the audience went, you know, tell us about your performance management system. And all of these big organisations across Australia talked about, well, we have a form, or we have it online, or we have, you know, this, and it drives 4 conversations a year and all of that. And Patty actually stopped them and said, if you sat down now and you looked at what are you trying to achieve? What is your ultimate goal in that having that performance management system in place? Are you trying to drive quality discussions? Are you trying to drive increased performance? What is it? And how many of you go back and look at the process that you have implemented and understand, does it actually drive the outcome you're trying to achieve? And that to me is actually the core of what you're saying here around focus on the right things.
Yeah.
You know, there is no, you know, people come to me and go, do you have a performance management form that we can put in place? I'm not interested in doing stuff like that. I'm not interested in creating processes for the sake of processes. I want to understand at the end of the day, what is that employee and that manager experience going to be as they go through that process? If they are dreading it, and they just fly through it as quickly as possible, throw any data on a page so that they can tick that box, then you are not achieving anything in that process.
Absolutely.
So that's probably the core thing for me. I mean, I love all of these 5 elements of the HR function, but that one to me is so critical to get right.
Absolutely, I couldn't agree more. Everyone actually doesn't like doing performance management.
I don't like doing performance management. I actually have the best discussions with my leader here because we don't talk about forms at all. We sit down and we have a discussion.
And it's mission.
And I don't think you and I have ever sat down with a form either, have we? I've got zero interest. Don't tell our in-house HR team that.
Yeah.
But I actually have zero interest in them. Sorry, Claire, if you're online listening to this.
So the third one is create an integrated HR operating model. And we talked a little bit around this in regards to the David Urich model. And I think this is really key in that how your actually function works and creating a HR model which is fit for purpose now, but also scalable for the future. And we've certainly worked in organisations where they've created a HR function and it's worked, and then they've tried to create a completely new operating HR function, and then they recognise that actually didn't work, and then have actually brought back a similar old function. So I think to that point, that's okay, but just make sure that it's possible and scalable for the future, that it is adaptable and it is able to change. And really key thinking about those people in the team. As I said before, you don't want to recreate mini-me's. You want to have people in your team that are going to be delivering in those 4 quadrants in the best way that they actually can to areas that they're passionate about. And I think you're going to get the best work from people in the areas that they're passionate about. My Janine, who I work with, is constantly telling me well, what are the areas that you love? What are the areas that you wake up every day and want to be, you know, achieving?
Yeah, exactly right. And for me, when we talk integrated HR operating model, I think people's eyes kind of glaze over sometimes and go, what does that mean? I know mine certainly did the first time I heard that sort of terminology. When we're talking about that, it's basically saying every element of what we do is aligned. So you start with the strategy, you get really clear on what that is, and you make sure that every other element of your operating model supports the delivery of that strategy. Do we have the right people and structures in place to deliver that? Whether that means business partnering or outsourcing or whatever that looks like, is that actually going to support the delivery on that strategic intent? Do we have the right processes and systems in place? I really love, again, when you read Patty McCord's stuff, she's really great at thinking about how does this process actually support the culture that we're trying to drive. If we're saying we've got a really flexible culture and we want autonomous decision making, and then we have processes that are really strict on 15 different people need to get involved and the last person can veto every other decision that was made, you have to understand how those things interact. So when we're talking operating model, we're talking about, do all of these things support the outcomes that you're trying to achieve? You know, do you have systems in place to help? If we're saying we're really metrics driven, we want to understand how we are achieving, and then we don't have systems that allow us to pull the metrics that are important to us, then that is not an alignment. If we say that these values are really important to us and yet the way we reward people is really misaligned to that, then that is not an aligned operating model. So sometimes what you find is people get really focused and going, well, we've got the right org structure, or we've got the right systems or whatever. But if you don't think about every single one of those elements, then your chances of actually achieving the outcomes that you're trying to achieve are so much more diminished.
Definitely. The fourth point in those 5 key would be looking at ensuring pragmatic and sustainable implementation. So delivering pragmatically and sustainably basically means that acceptance of that constant change and recognition that adapting quickly is key to organisation agility.
Yeah.
So really looking at what's, again, that change management. I think it's something key that we're going to be referring to quite a bit as we move for the future, as obviously as well as in this webinar. But, you know, what's our competitive advantage if we can actually adapt to that change and get our people across that change as well?
And I think that's, again, where you know, leaders really value people who can sit there and say, okay, what you're trying to achieve right now doesn't fit with the way we do things. Like, you know, our processes don't support that. But my goal is to enable, and if we can agree that that's what we need to do, then I'm not going to sit here with a list of reasons why you can't. Now, don't get me wrong, if there's a values misalignment, or there's a legal issue, then of course your role in HR is challenging that. But it's not to challenge for the sake of challenging and being rigid with, no, this is the way we set it up, it's the way it needs to happen. If your leaders are talking to you about saying, this is a challenge that we need to overcome as an organisation, then your role is in a HR perspective is to figure out, what do I need to help enable from a people perspective to help solve that problem.
Yeah, definitely. And the last one, of course, is building your HR capability too. So a little bit about saying, you know, making sure that you've got elements of all those quadrants, but it's also about building their HR capability, you know, really not forgetting, I guess, your own core team in building up their experiences and their own capabilities. You know, developing the HR professionals who have the necessary skills to really understand that business environment, who are going to understand the changes that are going to occur, that it can provide that value when they've got that seat at that table, or could do the analytics when it comes to, you know, talking about success and talking about, you know, the impact to the organisation and whether or not their strategy is actually making a difference.
It's interesting, you know, because I've seen this build happen in all sorts of different ways, and I have been the benefit of a huge amount of development over the years, and things like in different organisations, we've brought people in from the business to sit in HR, and it's been one, so that they could develop a capability from a HR perspective to take back into the business, and two, they would actually be sitting in the team and they would be sharing problems from a really different perspective. Also, as a HR person going out and doing a line role for a period of time can be a really empowering way to learn. You know, whether it's a full-time thing, whether it's going on a secondment and saying, I'm just going to be in that team on the front line for a period of time, that can be a really powerful way of learning. I've done all sorts of programs over the years, you know, finance for non-finance people, doing an MBA, you know, doing strategic HR courses, all of those sorts of things are all great ways of helping build that different capability. But I think you're right, often as HR people, we're so busy managing the learning and development for everybody else that sometimes our own kind of falls by the wayside.
Definitely.
And again, it's part of that whole alignment issue from an operating model. If you're not clear on where the gaps are, then it's really hard to figure out where do you need to invest in your HR teams building their capability. Yeah.
Definitely. So what is the value add? I guess we've spoken a lot about it today, and providing, I guess, a basic insight. But today I just wanted to sort of spend some time on, well, what is the value add that our HR professionals or the qualities of a HR team can actually do? And I've just sort of got some questions that I'm going to ask you. Obviously, can't hear your answers, but just for you to start thinking about for your own organisation and for your own teams and your own businesses. So thinking about, well, what's the organisational capabilities that my company must have to create products and services that result in our customers taking money out of their wallets and putting it into ours? So really thinking about what's the business side of thing, what's our consumable product that we can really then add to our talent management perspective. How can our people actually really achieve what they need to do to be able to be a successful organisation? What employabilities do our people need so they can understand and respond to short-term and long-term demands of the organisation? So again, really thinking about, again, who are the people in our organisation? What do we need to actually build them up with their own little toolkits in order for the business to be successful? How can we provide them with the capabilities that they need to be? What's the learning and development opportunities that they might need to have? And again, thinking more strategically rather than, okay, let's just put this person into that role. It might be meaning that, okay, well, let's move this person out of that role so we can move this person into that role to then, organise the structure efficiently. But, it's thinking more broadly.
Which in short is all about our 6 Bs of talent management and all of those sorts of things. So just getting really clear on how you align, how you get clear, where you're going in the future, what are the capabilities and how you're going to get people there.
Yeah, definitely. And so it's really thinking about how do we invest in HR practices that deliver those business results. So again, to our point of not doing things for the sake of doing them. So really investing in the key things that are actually really going to make your business succeed. How do we organise HR activities to deliver maximum value? We really don't want to be just doing something for the sake of ticking the box. How do we create an HR strategy that sets an agenda for how HR will our company succeed? So again, this is to Janine's point earlier, making sure all of those things are in key alignment. And I think this is the value add that we can provide to an organisation. This is how we can get them to start thinking about how they can possibly look at different aspects, thinking about their people and what does their people impact be. Yep. And how do we measure? So how do we know if we're actually being successful as a HR team? How do we know if we're actually providing that value add back to the business? So
having an impact.
Yeah, how do we actually know if we're having that impact? So again, you'd want to be constantly asking yourself, am I seeing a shift in behaviours based on a particular process? What is the key talent that's leaving their organisation? I think we, as most clients that we sort of see, as well as our own organisations, don't really understand that termination and understand what sort of talent are we losing and what's the value to the organisation that we're losing when talent walks out the door.
It's interesting because it's probably one of the first things we do is quantify the cost of turnover for an organisation, and it's usually a real eye-opener for the senior leaders to realise that when we're talking about investing in your talent, that's one of the no-brainers for me. Everybody sees it as an expense, and often that we bemoan HR's cost centre, it's really hard. When you get these metrics right, you can show the value that you create for an organisation by shifting in some of these areas. And what I find really interesting, because you've also, I know you've got here, sorry, I'm going to jump in, but you've got here around how engaged our employees and are we recruiting through the most effective channels and how effective are the training courses we provide. What I find really interesting is the number of organisations that report on this data with zero insight and zero understanding of, therefore, is this good, is this bad? When I talk to organisations and, they'll have reports that they run that just say our turnover is this. What does that mean? Well, they might even say the trend, it's getting better. Okay, but still, what does that mean? If you're talking about engagement data and I'll see, it's getting better, it's, moved 2 points. okay, so what?
Yeah.
You know, what's the impact of that? What are the things we're doing to drive the change in that? How will we know if any of those things are actually having an impact?
Absolutely.
So it's not just understanding what are the measurements, it's what are the insights that you take from those measurements, and how does that feed your strategic cycle and planning, so that you know, okay, we're going to shift and drive in these areas, and then we're going to see, we will know we're being successful if X, Y, and Z happens.
Yeah.
And then we'll go and assess that and go, if it wasn't successful, how are we going to shift it? And if it was, what are the learnings we're going to take from it to keep moving forward?
And I think too, many organisations from that engagement piece, they're too quick to actually do their engagement survey, get their score, but what was the insight from that data? Yes, you might have 70% engaged, but what about that 30%? What are the 30% of those people telling you that may be a key to actually understanding a bigger picture that some of those 70% have not completed correctly?
And what's interesting on some of those things as well, I see that I see a tendency sometimes for, well, we use a really generic approach to measuring engagement, and then we find it really hard, and I know I've done this, I've sat there trawling through those surveys and gone, what am I actually supposed to shift to drive engagement out of this? Because really the only issue was the flavour of the water and the the cordial in the kitchen, or, the types of milk we have on hand. It's really hard to sometimes get some valuable data out of it. So I do look at it and say, don't just do a survey for the sake of doing a survey. Really understand, is this going to measure stuff that's important to your organisation? Do you believe that the questions that you're going to ask, the answers that you're going to get, are going to provide you with insight that can help feed into your strategy? And if not, do something bespoke. Do something that aligns to the values of your business.
Absolutely.
Do something
Make it meaningful.
Yeah, do something that's actually going to give you real feedback, or don't bother asking the question.
Yeah.
If all you're going to do is go out and ask and not do anything with it, don't bother.
And then too, once you get that feedback, do something again with it. Again, it's almost like that performance management tool. I think so many organisations do these tailor-made engagements. They get all of this data, they can manage it, they can ease it, they can exactly see what their employees are saying, but then nothing happens. Yeah. And then the employees do it again 2 years later.
It actually feeds back into our whole discussion around building capability as well, because that data insight, it's actually really tough sometimes. You'll know, we've sat through, trawling through 120 questions trying to figure out what is actually driving the results. And often you'll find with these freebie employee engagement things, it's the survey, the results you get are so high level, it's almost impossible to draw any kind of insight. And then the hook is that you then have to go and pay for 10 different reports in the hope that one of those reports will actually provide you with the data that will give insight.
Yeah.
So one is pick the right tool. Two is build the capability internally to be able to actually understand the insights, or bring in people who do. Like, if you're going to do it properly.
Absolutely.
That's. Sorry, I get a little bit passionate about that stuff. And I know if you talk to Scott in our Adelaide office, he's our organisational psych. He's really passionate about it, saying, so many of these surveys don't actually truly give you the insight. So we waste a lot of time and energy and employee energy.
Yeah, absolutely.
Doing stuff.
Yeah. So it's just continually thinking about outside the box and not always doing something for the sake of doing something. I think that's probably one of our key messages for today. So just lastly, to finish up, I guess just to this quote here from Renee West, you can have the best strategy and the best building in the world, but if you don't have the hearts and minds of the people who work with you, none of it comes to life.
And for me, when you think about HR, HR in and of itself cannot go out and grab the hearts and minds.
Yeah.
We're not as a team the ones who are responsible for connecting with every single person. Where we are able to create those connections is actually via our leaders in the business, and providing that partnership with them so that they're capable of actually grabbing those hearts and minds. So it's not about HR being all warm and fuzzy and just being out there trying to make everybody feel like they want to be here.
Yeah.
It's actually about how do we make sure that we have the right leaders working in a way that that is able to actually engage with their staff and helping to coach and drive those changes. So I think when it comes down to it, really, that's the core value that we create from a HR function perspective.
Yeah, definitely. At this point, I'd like to invite everybody to actually submit some questions. Obviously, we can't respond to you through the webinar, but if you've got any questions or you want further information, we will be more than actually happy to respond directly to you. Or if there wasn't something that we covered off today that you're hoping to receive, feel free to actually contact us and let us reach out.
Definitely. You know, between us in this team, I think we've probably got a good 60 years of HR management experience in all different. Marianne and I between us probably have 40. So, and honestly, I think the whole journey of really building high functioning HR in Australia is a really exciting one. I think the more I work with businesses who get it, the more excited I get around the role of HR and what we can actually do. So if you're sitting in a role right now going, I'm really struggling to figure out how to engage with the CEO who doesn't get what I could be doing for them, or I'm actually not sure I'm giving what I should be giving, we're more than happy to connect and just, you know, have a chat and see if there's something we can do to help you out.
Definitely.
So we'll wrap up today by just showing you the upcoming webinars that we have. So in October, we'll be talking about the importance of emotional intelligence. And then our last one for the year, which should be a really interesting one, is around change management. And that's specifically looking at how do you fix a change that has not gone well, which unfortunately we experience a lot of, where we get at the tail end of a project and have to come in and try to figure out how to get something back on track. So by all means, join us for those webinars, or go back and have a look at any of our previous ones that are always on our website, and you can download them at any time. We will end with our usual disclaimer, which is that all care goes into this, but honestly, at the end of the day, whilst we bring together a whole lot of insights from all sorts of different research, etc., you will need to treat all of our information with the appropriate discernment, and you know, we always invite, as I said, questions, etc., afterwards. So thank you for joining us today. We hope we were able to give some insight and ask some thought-provoking questions.
Enjoy your Thursday. Thank you.